Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar by Phrase. Today, we are going to do an introduction to phrase strings. So thank you for finding the time to tune in and learn the basics of how to work with phrase strings. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. It is David McNamee. He is our enterprise solution architect, and he will do the demo for you today. David, how are you?
I'm very well, Clara. Thanks. Happy to be here.
Great. Great to hear. So the floor is yours. I will now stop sharing my screen and you can start.
Okay, so we're going to focus on phrase strings today, and you've probably heard our message by now that Phrase Localization Suite has a lot happening inside of it. Next week, we're going to be talking in more depth in the webcast around the TMS. Today, we're going to focus on phrase strings. Strings is designed to be a durable repository for structured content. So if you think about software development projects, design projects, where every single piece of text that appears on the screen has a name, and we talk about key values being that name. So you have your key, and then you have the actual text that's going to appear on the screen, and that's your value. So everything today revolves around this idea of keys and values. That is structured content. That's different from unstructured content, which is what the TMS is really, really good at. So think about your long form content that you post on websites and marketing content and InDesign brochures, those sorts of things. Those tend to be more long form, unstructured. We want that to be handled a little bit differently than what we do with structured content inside of strings. So looking around the strings interface, I am signed in as an administrator. I'm a recovering software engineer, so I have to sign in to everything as an administrator. And we see some extra tools here on the left. We're going to touch on these as we navigate through the tool. But the benefit, in part, of having a centralized repository for your strings is that you can apply assets that have been used previously. How you handle certain kinds of content, and you get to bring to bear other tools that can help with language. You can have your projects arranged in spaces. These are, you can think about them like file folders, directory structures, just something that will help you and your team navigate the multiple projects that you might have going on. In my case, I'm just separating things by maybe where I have integration points that I want to quickly get to. And we'll look around a specific project here. Maybe take a look at creating one from scratch near the end of the discussion. But inside of a project, we will have a collection of text, the strings and the values, and these will be organized essentially by language, but we can look at them once they're inside just as, you know, our list of values. So we can see these different keys in play. I can manually add a key, so we get an idea of what it really is we have happening behind the scenes. So maybe I have a name, maybe I have a naming convention. In this case, if you look at the content that's behind the scenes here, this is really all game related text, specifically baseball. So if I add a key manually, maybe it's a non-player. And my default translation is manager. Maybe we need to get that translated into multiple languages. And you have options for each of these keys that you add. So you can have rules around how do we pluralize. ICU pluralization is a pretty deep topic. We have other resources that go into it, but we can definitely talk about how you talk about multiples. Different languages handle this very, very differently. Do we want to exclude this key from certain languages? Do we want to have specific file format or data type formatting applied? Do we want to have a maximum length to our characters? And is there a screenshot that we have attached to this potentially as a reference? We can create that key. We've got the default value in here, and now we can go in and take a look at what that looked like to start working on a translation. I can jump right in and start managing my translations. I can select a target. Maybe let's start with Spanish. And now I have some tools at my disposal. Looking at the source text up here above, the potential translation down here at the bottom. I also have some suggestions because I do have machine translation enabled for this particular project. It's not a requirement, but it is there. We'll look at some of the rules around machine translation in just a moment. But you can see I have my suggestions. If I want to add references, add screenshots, add a direct link maybe to Figma preview, meta tags, all those things are there. I don't know if I like that translation particularly, but we'll just run with it for the purposes of our discussion today. You can have multiple steps involved in translating this piece of content. So we might just have one step where someone comes in, does the translation, and says, "Yep, we're done. Save that, validated, and we're finished." You might have an additional step where you require a person to now review the actual translation before it's ready for everyone to use. Translating content in this space, we make it really, really easy. You can invite people directly here. We're going to talk about that in just a second, but a few things that are happening in this space. We can move things around, give us a little more real estate to work. We can navigate the different keys that are already there. So we have existing translations that have been done. I have at least a few others that have been filled in and ready to go. So we can see the tags, options, job information, if it's added to a job, is there for us. For our translators, we can adjust the view, let them decide how it is that they want to work. Some people really like to see one key at a time. We can see multiple keys simultaneously. So we can very quickly see what's happening, navigate very quickly through and work on our translations. We can reorder the things that are in our sidebar. So move those around. Maybe we want to have the description toward the top, terms a little bit further down. We can hide our key list, give us even more real estate if we want to. Rearrange our layout. Some translators like to work side by side. Some translators like to work in the stacked view that we saw a moment ago. Really, it's a personal preference, so we let them be able to move around nice and easy. And of course, we have to have dark mode because everybody's got dark mode, and that's there for you if you want to use it. So having your collection of keys, having your translations in one spot, this becomes really the one version of truth for your values, for what should appear in your projects when you ask for a value in a specific language for that given key. If I go back to the homepage, summary page for this project, we can see the languages that we have associated with this project. You can have specific languages so that you are in control of the language activity. You don't want to necessarily have someone asking for translations for a language that you're not prepared to support at this time. And in this project, we are using locale-specific targets. So I have my source I've defined as the default, US English, and then I'm specifically targeting Mexican Spanish, Canadian French, Japanese, and Korean. We can add more language definitions here. And let's just say we want to add Portuguese. Okay. Actually, you know what? I want to add specifically Brazilian Portuguese. Okay. And being able to fallback language. If we have similar languages, maybe we can default back to a particular language. That option is there. How do we handle new content that's coming in? A number of options there for how you handle a specific language. And now we see there's my new language there. It's already assigned and said, hey, you've got 20 keys out here. None of them have been translated into Portuguese, so you can get started working on that. Now, we can, if we want to, just click through that 20 untranslated link and get to work and say, yeah, we're gonna start working on these translations now. More likely, you're going to have a language team or a vendor that is going to actually do that translation work. So if we come back and say, yeah, let's create a new job, let's manage this a little more effectively. And let's give this a little bit of a name here. Initial name. Can we set a due date? Let's give it a little bit more time here, be a little generous. If I'm using a ticketing system, if Jira specifically, I can have a URL to the tracking, so we can keep track there, and then which keys are going to be a part of this particular job. So I can select all of them, add them to the job, pick my target language, and now if I have particular translators that are going to work on this, I can select them and they will be assigned the work to come in and do these translations. So when I'm ready, maybe I have some additional commentary. Maybe I want to add more keys a little bit later. The job can start. Task assignments will go out. My translator can come in. They'll see the keys to which they've been assigned, and they can continue their work. Your team members, your colleagues who are invited into the space, you can have controls over what they see. So they could be limited to just a certain set of languages, certain set of jobs, projects. So you do have some control over what is seen there. If I go back to my overview, we'll see that job is now in progress, and we can see the progress of our other languages and what keys still need to be done there. Okay, so a couple of other things here with the strings editor itself. I want to call out a couple of things. And let me just pick a language here. Let me go back into Mexican Spanish, just because that is one of the more complete ones that we have. I mentioned that there are resources that we can look at applying and certainly reusing. So I see in my list of keys and values, I have a translation here. I look on the right-hand side, we have terms applied. So we can have a term base. If you have a particular way that you already know you want certain words short phrases to be translated because they're important to your business, they're important to your industry, they have to be done a certain way. We can define those in advance, and that will allow us to have some compliance checks as we go through. So, for example, if I look back at my project overview, you'll notice I have a quality assurance tab here, and I've got a big bright 1 next to it because it's actively identified an issue, and it's with the Canadian French translation, and it's telling me that, hey, there's actually a term that was defined, but hasn't been dealt with. So I can go in, take a look at that, or I can assign this to a translator to come in and resolve this issue. So my key here, player position catcher, my default value is the US English catcher. We've got a translation in here, the Canadian French. Lunatic, I don't think is the correct correct term for a catcher in French. There we are. So we have a defined term that's already there. This is our quality assurance mark. We are getting other suggestions. All right. So Google Translate is coming back and saying, yeah, use that. I'm going to use this definition because I actually got that from the Major League Baseball rulebook. So we'll do that, and we can fix that particular issue. Similarly, we can apply translation memory. So if I look at another key, and look at this, we can see, yeah, there's a Google Translate, but there's also showing me what has been translated before for this particular value. So if we see these values again, we can reuse what's already been approved as a translation. Machine translation, term bases, translation memory, they're all there to try and speed up turnaround time and deal with a large volume of content, but also try and enforce some consistency in the translation and control costs. Managing keys is the heart of everything that's happening here inside of strings. Default values, translated values, all of the assets that we can bring to bear on the keys themselves. Now, the question is, how do we add more keys? We saw a manual key entry, but that can be tedious if you have a lot. So you can actually upload a file, and this file can be any number of formats. So I may have a JSON file here. I may have an Excel workbook here. This will let me preview target languages here because I have potentially multiple items in here. Options for encoding, whether we're going to do proofreading and hold these things in a suspended state until they've been approved, and march on through there. So if you have a file that has your key value pairs, great, you can work with that. We support a lot of different file formats for ingesting content. One of the preferred ways of working with strings, since this is really tied to software development projects, is to work with your design assets and your source code repositories. And we can take a look at both of those here. So I have a GitHub repo that is holding some source code. Nothing too crazy right now. I've got it focused just on my language resources, but you can see that I've got essentially the same keys and same values that we saw inside of strings. So this could have been the source for my initial load with strings, but now I can keep this in sync. So my translations that I've just corrected, actually, what was that? That was a French Canadian. So if I look at my folder structure here, you can say I have that tied to language pair as well. and we can come back to my project, and I have GitHub sync in here, so I can import from GitHub and pull those keys in from my source file. And again, we can support a number of different formats in that source file. So in my case, I'm using a very simple JavaScript notation. We could be using a variety of more complex XML formats. We can also export, which is what I'm going to do here. So yeah, everything that's been approved since last sync, let's pull it all together and send that over to GitHub. And what I should see now is a pull request in GitHub, and there it is, just opened, and we can see, wow, there's been some changes here, and we can take a peek behind the curtain and see what changes are inbound. So yeah, there's that new key that's going into just about every file. Non-player position manager that's in there. We haven't translated it fully, but it's been added to the list. And my Portuguese translations, we don't have them ready yet, but we can at least get ready because we know it's coming. So it's got the stub put in there, and it's also created the folder structure. So we can have instructions for how to receive those keys and values, what format they should be in. That's important because once we're in strings, we're kind of divorced from file formats. So if I need to ingest it in one project in, say, an iOS appropriate format, we can do that. If I have another repo that's for Android, well, we can configure it so that the strings are emitted in an Android friendly layout. So that is one story for getting your strings values into your projects and keeping them in sync with phrase strings. We do have a command line interface. We do have an API for all of this. If we're actually talking about software projects and Git repos and those sorts of things, more advanced projects tend to like to script their repository behavior. You can absolutely include phrase strings as part of that and have really tight control over when synchronization happens, when those keys get pushed up into strings, when they come back as a pull request. Similarly, on the design side, if I go into a tool like Figma, this is Figma we're looking at here, and I have a layout. In this case, I have a hideous graphic that I put together for presenting some information tied to a baseball game. We have widgets or plugins, I should say, sorry, for Figma, and there's one for strings, and my keys can be kept in sync between Figma and phrase strings, and the values can be kept in sync. So if I change values here, I can push those values back into phrase strings, which also means those values can ultimately go into GitHub. Same thing happens in the opposite direction. If a developer is working, makes some changes, adds new keys, changes values, those can go from GitHub into phrase strings and ultimately make their way back into Figma. And if I say pull translations, I see a preview of my translations. And let's just move around languages here so we get a nice little preview. Yep, there we go. Let's pull those in, see what happens. I have some options for my behavior. Let's create a new page with translated content. Certainly, connect with existing keys and do that pull. See what happens there. Great, that's been done. Close that out. And I can now immediately see in Figma what my design would look like with the values for that particular language. So this is really speeding up the collaboration between developers and designers who can work in their own tools. So we work in Figma, we work in Sketch. On the developer side, we have integrations already with GitHub you've seen, Bitbucket, and then anything that you want to do through the API or the command line interface is going to work out just fine. One other thing that we can talk about in terms of phrase strings is, from a developer and a software perspective, is if we're doing mobile apps, Android, iOS, we do have support for over-the-air updates. Can't get too deep into it because we're getting into App Store territory here, but we can create a distribution, target the specific platforms, target the languages that we want to have included there, and then our projects. There we go. And then when we create that distribution, oops, yes. We'll have options for specifying whatever IDs and secret codes we have to have to be able to push that out. So for Google Play or the App Store, Apple App Store, you will have use for targeting your development environment separately from your production. So you can push your keys out over the air, which means if you've never done this before, you don't have to do a full redeploy of your solution, your application, to the App Store. So if your app is staying the same, but you're just updating the language, you don't have to do a total full deployment. We can do this easy push out. We can also talk about other integrations for strings. The API is out there. We do integrate with the Phrase TMS. So next week, you're going to see some things around advanced tools in AI and advanced workflows, some different tools for translators to be able to bring to bear. So you can look at that after seeing this, and you can start thinking about the best of both worlds. And then we have integrations with a number of different tools. These integrations, some of them, for example, Contentful, WordPress in particular, will make you think about that initial comment I made around strings being targeting software development and structured content, whereas the TMS is more long form content. So in the case of something like WordPress, you can think about strings being useful for the very controlled things like the user interface that's being presented. But you can also use the TMS for the long form content. So the blog entries, the article entries, those sorts of things. Same thing with Contentful. So we can start to bring these tools to bear on your different environments and use the right tool at the right time for the right kind of content. There are some other things we can dive into on any of these projects. One thing that I will touch on before we open it up for questions is that we do have a presentation of data, some analytics. So as a project manager, I can come in, I can see what's happening with my project overall. I know how many keys are there. I know what has and hasn't been translated. I can get a good idea of the work that is yet to be accomplished. And I can see what specific users are doing and see essentially where my translation activity is actually coming from, what's maybe been done by a pre-translation step and automatically applying machine translation or automatically applying translation memory versus what my actual users have done in here. So that's a lot for about 30 minutes. So we've seen adding keys and their default values, translating those default values into different languages, synchronizing our key database across different tools into, say, Figma, into GitHub, I'd like to open it up for any questions we might have, any other topics you want to dive into today.
That was great. Thank you so much, David. You really managed to cover a lot. So thank you for that. Now, I would like to take the time to invite our audience to next week's webinar, where we will be doing an introduction to Phrase TMS for project managers. So if you're interested, please go to phrase.com/resources/webinars and sign up. It's happening next week, Tuesday, same time as this webinar. So thank you for that. And now I will go to the questions. If you still have some, please submit them via Slido. And we have one question at the moment, and it says, can I test new translation releases via OTA before actually deploying them to users into production?
I feel like this is the single most popular question with strings and OTA. Yes, absolutely. You may have noticed on the OTA settings screen, there was a place to populate a development secret and a production secret. Those secrets are what really control the distribution point. So yes, you can have a different set of strings being pushed into test and test those out, see what they look like before going into production. It's a critical step. Highly recommend it if you're not doing that already.
Okay. Thank you so much. Mark it as responded. Next question from David. Phrase TMS has this general Git connector, which can connect to any Git repo, e.g. to Azure repos. Can phrase strings be integrated with other Git tools than GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket?
Yeah, it can. Small correction, TMS does have a general Git connector, but it does also have specific connectors for GitHub and a couple of others. Can we integrate with anything other than the three that we always hear about? We can. The caveat is that there might not be a specific connector, and that's not always a bad thing. So you think about the GitHub integration that I just showed. That's one strings project to one GitHub repository. If you think about most people's mobile device strategies, they have two repos. They have one repo that has their Android source and another repo that has their iOS source. So which one are you going to synchronize with strings? A lot of times that comes down to, well, we're not going to use any connector. We're going to use the CLI and we're going to use the API to work with our already scripted behaviors inside of our preferred Git repository, whether it's GitHub, whether it's Azure CI/CD tools. I can't remember what we're supposed to be calling them now, but it's based off of Git, or something else that's not based off of Git. The CLI tends to be one of the more popular paths for more complex solutions. If you just have one repo, one strings project, you can use those connectors. So we can take a look at the list of connectors that's out of the box. Those will be the repos that you can have that nice shiny button with. But if it's not listed, you can always fall back to scripting, which, like I said, most dev teams that I work with, they want to script their build behaviors anyway.
Thank you very much.
Generalization, I know, but
yeah, thank you, David. I don't see any other question at the moment, so that was a brief section, just two questions there. But thank you for answering, and thank you for the presentation. We will be distributing this recording tomorrow to everyone. So in case you want to rewatch and soak in the information, you will have the chance to do so. Thank you, David, and have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye now.